Hi, my name is Paul Ross. I'm head of marketing here at Affinity, and I'm joined by Kevin Zhang here from Bain Capital's Venture Group for our coffee chat. Just for everyone who's on the line, this event is being recorded and we'll share the link to all of the attendees after the event. And you can submit questions as we go along in the Q&A box. And any questions that we don't get to, we'll answer offline after the event. Kevin, thank you so much for spending some time with me.
Honored to be here and thrilled to be. I think this is sort of 4 years or so as Affinity customers. So we're honored to be part of your, I guess, your first coffee chat as well.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Kevin. Maybe you could just introduce yourself quickly, actually, to give the audience a sense of what you do at Bain Capital.
Sure, yeah. I'm a partner at Bain Capital Ventures. We're a sort of multi-stage fund. We're investing out of our, I believe, ninth fund, about $1 billion overall. Our team invests in a mix of venture and growth. We're probably weighted towards B2B and enterprise technology. Within that, I'm primarily focused on the very early stage. I'm often, as we might talk about later today, I'm often investing pre-seed, seed, Series A. And thematically, that's fallen into kind of fintech, business software, and a little bit of data infrastructure work.
Awesome. Thanks for that. So we're in December of 2021. How was your year in venture?
It's been it's been a crazy year, I think, for everybody. Of course, we're fortunate to have work in which we're safely ensconced in our home offices most of the time.
Yeah.
I think that if there are challenges, I think they are that it's been I think it's sort of maybe several things. One is that the market and technology feels like it's changing faster this year than in the years prior. I've been doing this for 5 years.
Yeah.
It's never felt like there's been more platforms that are working, more theme areas we can invest in, and more talented founders, frankly, who are leaving sort of safe jobs to sort of get in the pool while the water's warm. I think that one element of it as well is that's the combination of all this opportunity and great talent, as well as just all the money flooding into kind of the space. I think sort of we look at sort of sequentially, like just VC funding volumes are up dramatically, and that's resulted in a very competitive environment. I think that's led to higher valuations, larger round sizes, lower dilution for founders, and importantly, from a workflow standpoint, the need for us to move very quickly on decisions. Generally, things that maybe we would have had 2 or 3 weeks. We now feel we must come in with a prepared mind and occasionally be ready to make a decision over the course of 48 to 72 hours. So there can be things that come in and are decisioned on before they ever reach a weekly pipeline review. And then lastly, I think that with the emergence of very active late stage funds, I think that's resulted in everybody moving steadily and sequentially earlier. I think that the interesting thing about that, of course, is that at some point you migrate from thinking about companies you can look up in PitchBook or Crunchbase, and you start thinking about people. And when you start working in the world of like people who might start companies, of course, the addressable number of opportunities becomes an order of magnitude larger.
Right.
So we end up, it's sort of a larger top of funnel to process. So I'd say sort of from a technology like macro standpoint, from a level of competitiveness, and just from like this move to be more competitive, more timely, more people, all that has made our jobs harder, but I think hopefully the lives of founders easier.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that on the vendor side, like that dynamic even works for and against us as well in terms of we recently did our Series C and went through that kind of like some of that experience as well, and saw how some of the folks on the venture side were behaving very differently than they have historically, which is interesting. I know that Bain has kind of focused a lot on building a great tech stack to help you do your job. Have you made the most of that this year? Like, what's been the things that have driven that? Obviously, we can talk about the CRM side of it in a moment, but like, what's been the broader kind of like, have you thought about dealing with that from a technology perspective and doing your job more effectively?
Well, I think that's something that's become very apparent to us this year. I think a couple of things. One is I think that the the sourcing imperative has gotten stronger. That is to say, I think that it's very important for us to see more, as we mentioned earlier, the addressable number of opportunities is larger, and so I think that's led us to make investments in technology that that supports kind of higher velocity and discovery work. We can talk more about that. I also think that my other observation from this year and of the industry, perhaps more broadly, is that we now work in a world in which it used to be that you would just have when you look at the headcount overall of a venture investment team, other than executive assistant staff, it's generally been entirely kind of investors, check writers and check writers in training. And now the team looks much more heterogeneous. We have a data science capability, we have talent practice, we have increase our customer development, et cetera. And so with more diversity of headcount, I think implies like we will need technology and infrastructure that looks more like a normal company. We don't have, for example, a knowledge base. And that was okay when we were sort of maybe 15, 20 people who all kind of work together day to day on investments, but it's not okay when we're onboarding, our third recruiter, and they need to be familiarized ourselves with our portfolio and our practices and our processes. That's just one example, I think, of how we will need to invest further in enabling infrastructure, given that the nature of what founders expect from us, and therefore the nature of who we have on the team is evolving.
Yeah. Well, and it also points towards like how you mentioned like their access to the information about what's been happening at the organization historically and who they've engaged with. Obviously a big thing for us here at Affinity. And it's interesting, I've seen the same trend actually play out in other sectors as well, and kind of related areas. Investment banking, those guys have more and more look like more like a SaaS demand gen led, scaled information business than ever before. So I think it's kind of interesting that you're seeing this case there. So you mentioned earlier that Bain's been a client of Affinity's actually since 2018. It's been a while, and I'm sure your use of the platform has evolved over time. Can you maybe walk me through some of that history and how you're using the platform in the context of what you just outlined today?
Sure. Yeah, I think about it as, crawl, walk, run. I think anytime you're doing kind of a level of change management as with sort of swapping out something so core as the CRM, I think that's the realistic path. I was fortunate to have a supportive team and ultimately we were on a prior vendor that had very little engagement, that required a lot of manual entry. And I think we all recognize the reality is if the data doesn't get into the CRM, you don't have a CRM. And so for us, I think about it in three phases. The first phase was simply data ingestion. I think one of the things that we felt was incredibly compelling about Affinity is sort of the data science relationship intelligence element, where a lot of it's sort of record creation by default, and by sync rather than by manual entry. And so our first mission was simply to get all of the data into Affinity and so it can be collaborated on. Didn't matter so much in this first phase whether every individual partner was actually creating a list in Affinity, so much as that they had pressed the button and selected their privacy settings, and that we had data about who they were meeting and when. And then there was a second phase of operationalization around that. We have sort of sub teams here that cover distinct subject matter, business software, fintech, and we sort of created kind of model processes, weekly reviews where we create a template sort of pipeline list that sort of the teams adopted over time, where we use that as sort of a source of truth of what's going on, what people are working on, allows people to communicate about that. And I think that's sort of been an important, that sort of put Affinity in the center of a lot of our, week to week operational processes. I think the phase that we're in now, we'd like to believe is kind of like, what can we do to run with it and really maximize the potential of Affinity in the organization? As I think I've shared with you before, there's a few ways we're doing that. One of the things we think about is better leveraging the signals element, the alliances element, We have a couple of programs here that I think are very common in the industry now. We take LP positions in solo GPs, and we work with participants in essentially a scouting program. We feel those are like very natural folks to onboard to an alliance's capability that would give us visibility and give them visibility, to where we can be reciprocally helpful. We have a data science function now that where we believe we will be able to hopefully, enrich existing leads with new intelligence, and also, identify potential opportunities for, record creation and assignment in Affinity. These are just some examples, but we feel like now that it's the basis of our work and processes, we can layer in and level up how we use it to be more effective.
That's awesome. I think it's really interesting, like going through that evolutionary process of taking advantage of like automated contact and client or our prospective investor creation within the CRM, and then kind of evolving that into, as you were saying, how do you actually manage deals. But one of the things that really struck me there was that you were talking about like the data science parts, and the fact that earlier you mentioned that you were starting to kind of look even earlier in the kind of evolution of a founder into a kind of a full-blown startup. How is data kind of being used there? What you can share is because we've seen the same thing of like more and more demand for data that's going to help identify the right type of organization or the right type of person in that like earlier and earlier investment identification. What have you guys been doing this year that you think is going to change how you approach that?
I think that we are recognizing that in a lot of seed investments nowadays, some kind of agreement is struck before the founder leaves their prior job. And so, the universe of what we're looking for may not even be sort of post-incorporation people. Mm-hmm. And, I think this is where the relationship-oriented sort of thesis of Affinity, I think it was from, I think it was grounded, in which the company was grounded from the very beginning, is so valuable. I think that we're no longer, I think, selling at a point in time. This is no longer people start a company, they incorporate, they find customers, and then they actually run a process. I think it's a much more loose, long-term relationship with someone in which we are, in some ways, hopefully co-building with them, and eventually that leads to an investment, and that is a relationship to be managed and not an opportunity to be sold. And so I think that has been a change in at least our early stage investing mindset. And I think I'm glad that we have Affinity for that, because I think that we're able to make contacts, a first-class citizen in our processes. You can create pipeline lists of individuals with sort of relation, and we can sort of do things like think about, here are some people that we would like to make sure we have an ongoing dialogue with at least once a quarter, and we can sort by the last time we had a meeting with them, last time we had an email exchange with them. That I think is an important capability, and I think more fully realizes the vision of the product.
Yeah, it's really important to us, like this idea of the CRM existing to be a place where you store information, which is, as you mentioned, highly useful. But then it's how that gets used as organizations evolve and structure. Like the relationship intelligence side of this is something I've heard a lot from VCs this year, in terms of even later stage investments of like, we had this person in our CRM, we had regular communication, we had it more structured. It starts to look more like, as we were talking about earlier, like an enterprise B2B relationship of nurturing that person over time, so that even when they're doing a Series C or something, you have that relationship and you have that history with them that you're able to go to, especially in the, like, as things have got way more competitive. You mentioned the importance of like that data being there and created. I know that Bain were one of our early larger venture clients, and investment clients in general. And you had some really important requirements in terms of meeting your data compliance needs. You've got all these different teams, you've got all of this data that you're doing. You are effectively like more like an enterprise client than many of the other people that we'd seen at that time. And this is going back to 2018. So I know that's something that was important to you as an organization. You know, after all, we're kind of, as you said, we're capturing all of the email and calendar information into our system to automatically populate and keep your CRM up to date. But walk me through that thinking in terms of dealing with that security and compliance challenge. Like it's an interesting thing that many of our prospective clients bring up when they think about the fully automated approach to kind of contact creation that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, for those in your audience that may not have the context, our ventures team is sort of about 40 or 50 people in the broader context of Bain Capital, a global alternative asset manager. We manage over $130 billion. We have over 1,000 team members in the United States, but also in Europe and in Asia and Japan. And sort of seemingly new geographies and new asset classes every day. We are therefore, a regularly scrutinized entity, regulated, by financial regulators in the United States and in many other geographies in which we operate. We have we have an in-house broker dealer, and so you can imagine, therefore, that our company takes data security very seriously, as I think we should. I think that I would say that on a base level, and then I have some other thoughts. At a base level, I think it helps that we in ventures have a little bit of a more sort of openness to risk. I think we obviously invest in sort of modern tools. We work with lots of our companies. We recognize that there are sort of trade-offs for for convenience and data security. We're probably the worst offenders at Bain Capital of going rogue and using tools that we think are effective for us. And I will admit that I think that was part of our initial adoption of Affinity. I think there was a group that was willing to sort of at least try out and ascertain, is there a meaningful productivity benefit? Do we in fact get much better intelligence from adopting this? But at some point, of course, as the adoption grew, it was inevitable that we would need to go through a compliance and security review. So I guess I would think about three topics that I feel like we addressed with Affinity. The first is that we have a global CISO. We have a security team. They work closely with the Affinity team. In fact, I think you and I have spoken about we were perhaps a driving force behind some new features around SSO and other sort of enterprise security capabilities. Of course, our team ended up being satisfied with the practices, and I have to imagine it was not necessarily the most fun process for your team to go through, but we're grateful you did. I think that I think our security team is very thoughtful and I think holds vendors to a high standard, and so I take it as a positive sign that we were able to make it through that gauntlet. The second, I think, is sort of record retention, more sort of compliance related versus security related needs. We had certain record retention policies we wanted to keep. I think we were able to work with your team on sort of capabilities around that I assume have now translated to other clients and maybe useful. We as part of that, we also sort of thought about kind of privacy settings and whether we wanted to default to subject line available, content available or not. And then lastly, to be honest, at the time we thought about vendor continuity. So it was an earlier stage company at the time, but I think we felt even then that there's sort of this special team around this, and that sort of you guys would execute. I guess we were right, except in that we did not then actually invest in the company, which was perhaps a common mistake. But I certainly said that we got satisfied. That I imagine anyone else looking at the business today would have far fewer questions about that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. Is and one of the advantages of this audience, many of whom are on the line are in venture as well, have that knowledge of startups go through that evolution, and often have that trajectory of getting capability in market and then coming up against an enterprise client. What was great about this for us in terms of working with you at Bain was that we did that early, and we were able to really build that directly into the product. And then being able to, as you mentioned, like multinational, dealing with GDPR is a core part of what we do, and learning how to do that with a company of your size and scope was really helpful to us. And as you said, we've then built that into everything else that we've done with many of our other more enterprise type clients that we work with globally. We're now up to almost 2,000 clients, so it's an interesting process to go through for sure.
Totally, and I think I think enterprise adoption of Bain Capital is an ongoing project, as you know. But I would give the example that our technology opportunities team, which is sort of a sister fund here that is more in the mid-market, sort of mid-market technology private equity world, sort of late stage of growth equity world. You may have heard they recently led a financing for Mixpanel. We operate, obviously very closely, but they care a lot about, like, have we had a conversation with a certain company maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years ago? Is there a relationship that could help them sort of rekindle a conversation? And it's been interesting to see that workflow emerge. I'll get emails,
so that's like the capturing of that history. Your engagement is informing your later stage investments now.
That's certainly from a relationship standpoint. At least like, what did you think about at the time? What questions did you ask? What were the reasons why we were or were not involved as an investor? And that I think informs them and their prioritization as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Hey, you mentioned one thing earlier that I didn't drill into. That I'd love to. You mentioned the alliances capabilities. That's something that more and more organizations are starting to do. Our VC customers. And for those who aren't familiar with it, it essentially allows a client of Affinity to connect and allow other people to basically share their network in a secure way, so that the people that that can be seen by. It sounded like that you were starting to do that. Is that with some of your portfolio companies that you were, or even before they become portfolio companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that I would say that we were not very thoughtful about how we use alliances to be, initially. I think it was sort of like, oh, like my friend invited me, I'm going to add them. And I think that we would like to be more intentional about that moving forward. I'm trying to think if we have. I don't know that we have a lot of portfolio companies that are, primarily using Affinity as their CRM. Certainly, would be, that would be an interesting use case. They sort of fall back on LinkedIn today for, I think, the use case we're describing, which is sort of, does my investor have a connection with this company? We'd be open to it. I think it depends a little bit on just, the trade-offs, with using a particular CRM for them. I think one audience we do think a lot about is, our seed